Hi, I know you guys have been sitting for a long time. It's only 20 more minutes. So the title of this talk is a systems-psychodynamic approach to dismantling racial inequality in organizations. And I'm really excited to be able to share this work with you. This talk draws on 3 different projects that are collaborations with Robin and with my colleagues at BU, Bill Kahn and Charles Chu. So the starting point for our thinking is the starting point for a lot of other talks as well, the persistent failure of organizations to address the inequality problem when it comes to race and gender inequality. And there's a growing literature from many people in the room that documents how most DEIB initiatives actually fail to close the race and gender gaps that they target. For example, I'm thinking about things that we've talked about, like unconscious bias training or mentorship programs or initiatives to de-bias performance evaluations. And if we look across all these different types of initiatives, there's really little evidence that they do what we want them to do on outcomes like hiring, promotion, or retention. When we do see effects, they're often small and really specific to organizational cultural conditions. They fail to sustain long-term behavioral shifts, often resulting in shorter-term attitudinal shifts. We know that if we make them mandatory, they can backfire and lead to backlash effects. And often they either target all members of the organization or just subordinate group members who don't actually have the power to shift systems. And my co-authors and I find the persistence of the problem of inequality a problem worth studying in its own right. The inability for us to figure out what would it take to change organizations to address this inequality problem. We can send people to the moon, we can do all these other amazing things, but we can't solve this problem. And we wondered, what if instead of looking at the problem, we focus on theorizing that persistence? And we asked, what if there are unconscious dynamics at play that make it more functional for some people, those in the dominant group, to preserve and maintain inequality? So instead of asking, what's wrong with Black and brown people, why can't they get promoted? We ask, what unconscious systemic forces have kept them from receiving opportunities and advancing in organizations? Okay, our theoretical focus is on the dominant group's unconscious process of externalizing their distressing feelings and how that not only undermines organizational effectiveness, but also our collective humanity, and how by diminishing the oppressed, oppressors diminish themselves. Our theory also speaks to how organizations, as social systems that are propagated and created by dominant groups, aid and abet in this process. So in other words, how organizations collude in these dynamics. And our aim here is really, like others have said, to develop meso-level theory with a psychological and systemic explanation for the persistence of racial inequality in organizations. Okay, we focus on white men as the dominant group because they've been the long-standing dominant group in the US from the nation's founding until today. And in this work, we treat Black people as the archetypal subordinate group because of their long history of systemic subjugation in the US, beginning with the widespread institutionalization of slavery, and because of the social construction of the racial categories and a racial hierarchy that places white at the top and Black at the bottom. Slavery was vital to the success of capitalism in America and to the construction of the idea of a free white American man. And I think that this quote from Toni Morrison really illustrates that point well. Nothing highlighted freedom if it did not, in fact, create it, like slavery. I'm using a lot, there's a lot going on in this talk, and so I just want to walk you through where we're headed. I'm going to start by talking about a work context that conflates merit with idealized images of white masculinity. I'm going to talk about how that gives rise to a distress for people who aspire to that white hegemonic masculine ideal. And I'm going to talk about how they manage that distress with a defense mechanism. There are a lot of defense mechanisms. We're going to talk about one, projective identification, that's interpersonal and involves another person to fully defend against conscious awareness of that distress. I'm going to talk about how this group with disproportionate power is able to mobilize social defenses that are in the organization to help them in this, and how that constructs a defense system that ultimately alleviates these unbearable feelings. I'm really excited to talk about the substitute problem, which is an offshoot of this model. So that was actually just a teaser. So those are some of the words, that's where we're going. Let me get started. In this work context, in America, under capitalism, we have a white, hegemonic, masculine ideal, and that is a man in power, a man with power, and a man of power. What does he look like? He's rich, he's white, he's heterosexual, he's competitive and stoic, he's rational and confident. I hope you're imagining something. And I wonder if you're imagining something like this, but without the accent. This is who we maybe want to be at work or who we think we should be. And what's important about trying to be James Bond is that demonstrating these traits authorizes men to claim privilege, to elicit deference, and to resist exploitation. And in organizations, processes of evaluation and exclusion conflate merit with this white hegemonic masculine ideal. And we argue that this work context gives rise to a sea of unconscious distress, feelings of insecurity and doubt, and what we focus on in the model is how that's managed by the group. So as a group that has the most privileged position in the social order, they still have to reckon with the fact that they are not who they would like to be or feel that they should be, and that they maybe have not earned the things that they have today. And to understand this, we call it white hegemonic masculinity threat. We turn to two different literatures, literature on masculinity threat and literature on white identity management. And we think there are two components to white hegemonic masculinity threat. There's this, I am not man enough, which we shorthand, I am inadequate. And there's this, what I have has not fully been earned, which we shorthand, I am undeserving. The experience of this threat leads to this unconscious distress, and this is what sets the stage for protective measures like defense mechanisms to kick in. So to manage any kind of inner contradiction or tension about who we all are, we all use invisible defense mechanisms. They're unconscious. Things like projection or denial, regression. I'm going to talk about one, projective identification, which is also a defense mechanism, but it's the only one that enlists another person in it to fully function as a defense, which is to say, to make sure I never have to feel those feelings so that they can stay deeply unconscious. Okay, so I want to give you an example of what this could look like at work, and I beg you to imagine that this person on the screen is me. Let's pretend that that's me and I'm at work, and something happens. So maybe I make a mistake, or I don't speak up in a meeting and I'm bummed about that. I get a mediocre review, or I miss some sort of deadline. We would argue that this threat gives rise to an unconscious distress. This leaves me carrying these feelings of inadequacy, of undeservingness, and of shame. And let's say that I work in a diverse workplace and I have the opportunity to run into a Black colleague. Our theory argues that I would unconsciously engage in a process known as splitting and projection, where I really want to rid myself of this, and I'm going to project it onto another person who's there, onto this Black colleague of mine. You might know some of these maneuvers, they might be familiar to you. I might say, I don't see you as Black, or, you were a diversity hire. Or I might say, wow, you were so articulate in that meeting. Or I might say, your hair is unprofessional. Or I might just lament, it's really impossible for me to get promoted around here as a white guy. These are microaggressions that we're recasting, but we argue that unconsciously, they are intended to make sure that I project those bad feelings into the other person. And I'm able, if I can imagine that they feel insecure, I can convince myself, you know what, I'm actually confident and in control. I am who I thought I was. Now, what's the effect of this for the Black colleague? We think double consciousness, is related to this at a minimum, and we think there's a range of responses from resistance to stereotype threat. We really want to highlight for you that for white men as a group, the societal power that was illegitimately accorded to them, that licenses them to denigrate others, is actually the source of their own insecurity. Now, I've been talking about projective identification and interpersonal mechanism. But that's not the only thing that's going on in our model, because this is a group that also has a lot of power in organizations to mobilize features of organizational life to help them defend against this anxiety. So when I say features, I mean things like how we structure work, prevalent discourses at work, any kind of work practice. I'll give you a couple examples in 1 second. Let me briefly describe how 3 discourses of meritocracy, colorblindness, and rationality are mobilized as a social defense to defend against this anxiety. So meritocracy is a notion that rewards are earned on the basis of individual talent, effort, and achievement. And what does this discourse do? It justifies the hierarchy in the organization, it legitimates the standing of the group at the top, and it locates responsibility of fit for failure in Black people who just don't measure up. Let's talk about colorblindness, the discourse that race-based differences should not be taken into account, which we might see as, ostensibly race-neutral policies and practices. What does colorblindness do? How does that work as a defense? Well, it makes it so that we can't talk about race. It distorts the problem by severing it from its systemic history and embeddedness, and it makes it so that we definitely can't talk about systemic racism. And lastly, the discourse of rationality, one of the core tenets of bureaucracy. The notion that we should all try to be rational, that we want to be logical and use only deductive reasoning. What does this do? It makes it so that we don't talk about feelings. It validates the group that is disavowing their psychic distress, and it actually stigmatizes the exact work that we might need to be doing if we want to change the system. Back to me on the screen. What do these discourses look like in practice? They can look like a firm that says, we are an eat what you kill firm, or putting in long hours here is a show of strength and stamina. Or it might be a firm that says, leave your feelings out of it. Those are the types of things that can be mobilized as a social defense. Sorry, I also want to highlight that these are mutually reinforcing organizational features. It's really hard to tease them apart. All right, let me recap where I think we've been. I've lost track of time. I've talked about a work context where processes of evaluation and exclusion conflate merit with idealized images of white masculinity, and how that gives rise to threats that fuel psychic distress, which get managed by an interpersonal defense mechanism known as projective identification and are bolstered by these social defenses. They erect a defense system in organizations, and they reduce the stress for the dominant group, but they also give rise to a substitute problem that might be familiar to us all, a shortage of meritorious Black people. And what does that do? That ensures that we focus on this other problem, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and we don't look back at what's going on with the work context. It also ironically amplifies the exact threat that we're theorizing. I think we're probably all familiar with this substitute problem because it's in most organizations. It's known as the pipeline problem or the turnover problem, or in private, some people might say they're not qualified problem. And what's neat about it is it's a problem that cannot be solved because it's been misspecified. And so it's always going to be there. We get to work on that the whole time and ensure that we never talk about the work context or the anxiety and the response. So our theoretical model points to numerous intervention opportunities. We can think about changing the work context. We can think about launching campaigns to change the cultural narrative around these discourses that are getting mobilized in a defensive way. We would argue that you'd face resistance with any of those change initiatives, and that we take a systems-psychodynamic view and hold that the initial work is at its core intrapsychic and relational, which I think is consistent with what we've been talking about. We would argue that to disrupt persistent racial inequality, it requires a shift from a defensive way of organizing to a developmental one, so that people can take stock of how they're experiencing organizations and each other and move away from these simplistic ways of relating to more complicated, realistic ones. And our approach that we outline involves 3 mutually reinforcing holding environments. And I kind of think we've actually been talking about holding environments all day. I'm going to talk about senior leaders and the work I think they need to do to build this organizational holding environment. I'm going to talk about an intra-group holding environment and an intergroup. Okay, so what's a holding environment? It's a social context. It can be an interpersonal dyadic relationship, it can be a group, but it is an environment, it is a relational space that reduces disturbing affect, so it contains, and it facilitates sense-making so that we can interpret and make sense of what's going on in service of strengthening our capacity to effectively handle hard things like changing organizations to address racial inequality. What do you need? Not everything can be a holding environment, and not all relationships are. You need trust in the movements that people are taking towards you. You need competent and available holding and receiving. You need boundaries, and you really need positive experiences, a track record of positive experiences and outcome to sustain these relational spaces over time. And we think of holding environments as spaces that create the capacity for this kind of change. Okay, let me start with senior leaders, who we think their purpose in this work is to create the organizational holding environment. What does that mean? That means finding ways to license, to authorize, to anchor, and motivate organizational members as they struggle through this work. And in practice, more specifically, that can mean providing a vision, a purpose, providing the actual language, and legitimating the work that needs to be done to dismantle racial inequality. It means for senior leaders reorienting the organization away from hegemonic masculine image goals, and it also means doing their own psychological work to serve as role models for everyone else. The second holding environment that we think is important is the intragroup one, which is really a small group setting for people who are members of the same identity group. I'm going to focus on the one for white men. The purpose of this space is really to give them the opportunity to identify and own the distressing emotions that they may feel around this threat, rather than defend against. That means intrapsychic work, and that means engaging in the reparative process of coming to terms with the loss of this falsely supreme identity. The last holding environment that we think is important is the intergroup holding environment. And this is a group, also a small space across race, everyday task groups that once they have the capacity to do some of this can begin to address the manifestations of inequality in their workplace, in their routine everyday interactions, but also in the organization's policies more broadly. What does that mean? That means learning the skills of how to have difficult conversations, how to frame them, how to do so non-defensively and without judgment, and being able to investigate together at the unintended, because they're unconscious, consequences of people's actions and of the organization's policies and practices. Okay, wow, I think I'm crushing it on time. All right, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Bell Hooks' book, The Will to Change, about men, masculinity, and love. Feminist advocates collude in the pain of men wounded by patriarchy when they falsely represent men as always and only powerful, as always and only gaining privileges from their blind obedience to patriarchy. I emphasize that patriarchal ideology brainwashes men to believe that their domination of women is beneficial when it is not. Patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples. If men are to reclaim the essential goodness of male being, if they are to regain the space of open-heartedness and emotional expressiveness that is the foundation of well-being, we must envision alternatives to patriarchal masculinity. We must all change.